Hey guys, Taufik here. In this video, let's try to solve an SQL query where we will need to transform the data from row level to column level. Now in SQL, whenever we have to transform row level to column level data, we generally use the concept of a pivot. But not every database supports pivot. For example, in Microsoft SQL Server and in Oracle, pivot operator is supported. But when it comes to PostgreSQL database, instead of pivot, they have something called as CROSSTAB function. Now CROSSTAB function kind of does the same thing that a pivot does, but the syntax is slightly different. And when it comes to MySQL database, neither pivot nor crosstab is supported, but rather we can transform row level to column level data in MySQL using the case statement. So in this video, I'm going to first showcase you an SQL problem where you will need to do this kind of transformation. We'll try to first analyze the input data. We'll then see what the expected output is. And then we will try to solve the SQL problem using pivot in Microsoft SQL Server and in Oracle. And then we will try to solve the same problem using crosstab function in PostgreSQL database. And finally, we'll see how to solve the same problem using case statement in MySQL database. Now this problem was shared to me by one of my subscribers called Winkle. So Winkle, if you're watching this video, thank you so much. And anyone else, if you have some interesting SQL problems which you would like me to make a video about, definitely share them in my email. I'll leave my email ID in the description below. I have already got a few SQL questions on my email. I'm going to be covering them pretty soon. Now before I can start, all the data sets, the SQL queries, the scripts that I will be writing in this video, I will be sharing them in my blog as well as in my Discord channel. So if you want, you can download them for free. I'll leave the link to my blog as well as to my Discord channel in the description below. Finally, if you like my work and if you'd like to support this channel, definitely consider subscribing, and a like on this video and your comments definitely helps a lot in helping YouTube to recommend this video to a larger audience. Thank you, and let's begin. Okay, so let's start by looking at the problem statement. As you can see here, this basically is my input table or my input data. Here you can see that I have three different columns. It's basically the sales order table where we have the sales date, and then we have the customer ID, and then we have the amount. This basically means this is when the sale happened, on which date. This is the customer who purchased the sale, and this is the amount of that particular sale order. Now our requirement is to transform this row level data into something which looks something like this. Okay, so from row level data into column level data, and when doing so, there are a few different things that we need to do. Okay, so as you can see here, we need to transform this sales order data such that we need to aggregate the sales amount for each customer based on each month. Okay, as you can see here. So this is the first thing that we will need to do. So the first three records here, and with these, all these, I think 13 columns are basically the aggregation of sales amount for each customer for each month. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is, additionally, you have one more aggregation that is required, which is basically the last record. And this is kind of like the aggregated sales amount for each month irrespective of any customer. Okay, so the previous data was segregation of sales amount for each customer for each month, and the last record is basically the aggregation of sales amount for each month but irrespective of the customer. So that is why instead of customer, it's just mentioned like total. Okay, and then finally we have another requirement here which is mentioned in the last column, which kind of is the segregation or basically aggregation of the sales amount for each customer irrespective of the month. Okay, so that is what we need to display here. Okay, so it's kind of three different things that we will need to derive from this input data and then finally showcase the output in this kind of format. Okay, and they have given a condition here telling that all the negative values. So you can see here, there are few negative values here. These negative values, when we did the transformation into the output, it has been displayed with a parenthesis. So all the negative values should be represented within the parenthesis. Okay, that's also one additional thing that we will need to do. Okay, so I hope the problem statement is clear, the input data is clear, and the expected output is clear. Now let's try to solve them, and we'll try to first solve them using the Microsoft SQL Server database. Now here I'm using the Azure Data Studio tool to connect to my Microsoft SQL Server database. Now what I have done is I have already loaded the input data into a table called as sales data. So if I just run this, you can see that this is basically my sales data. I have just copied this entire input data into this table, and from this table we'll try to write our SQL query, which will kind of give us the expected output. Okay, So as I told you, in Microsoft SQL Server, whenever you have this kind of a requirement where you need to transform data from row level into column level, the concept that we can use is something called as pivot. Okay. Now, in order to use the pivot operator in Microsoft SQL Server, there is kind of a different syntax for your SQL query that you will need to follow. And the SQL query would something look like this. So you just need to have select star from, and inside your from clause, this is where you basically need to mention your base query. Okay. This is basically your base SQL query, kind of like your raw data. Okay, that is what you need to mention here. And after that, you need to mention your pivot operator or pivot keyword. And inside the pivot keyword, this is where you will need to mention a couple of things. The first thing is the aggregate function, whatever aggregate function that you will need to use in order to do the aggregation. And then finally, for column values, that is for whatever values are returned, or basically what are the number of columns that you want to derive from this data, right? Those column names you need to provide it here. Okay, so I can just tell for column values in some whatever the list of columns that you will get. In this particular case, you can see that from this particular input data, we need to come up with this data, and here the different columns that we are creating is Jan-21, Feb 21, March 21, etc. So here the value should be something like Jan 21 and so on and so forth. Okay, so this here is basically the syntax of how you can write an SQL query using pivot in Microsoft SQL Server. Now, the first thing that we will need to do is we'll need to come up with a base query. Of course, we can use the query that we already have, that is select star from sales data, which is kind of having this raw data. But we need to do some small transformation here in order to kind of make it ready for our aggregation. Okay, the first thing is you can see here that we have this amount field, and this amount field is basically a varchar in this case, and it has this dollar symbol. So, and we know that we will need to do an aggregation, because you see here for customer 1 there are 3 records. So when we will come up with our final output, you can see here for customer 1 it's displaying Jan has the amount as 150, right? So meaning that we kind of will need to sum up this amount for this month. Okay, you can see here this is Jan 1st, Jan 2nd and Jan 3rd of 2021. So we'll need to do this kind of aggregation. So since we'll need to sum up this amount, first of all we will need to remove that dollar symbol. Okay, but in our final output we still have dollar. So what we will do is first we will remove this dollar symbol in our base query, and then finally when we will come up with our final output, we'll try to add it back. Okay, so that's the first transformation. Secondly, you can see here we have this sales date with the date, month and year, but what we really need is we are only interested in the month and the year. We are actually not bothered on which date in the month the order happened, right? So we will just transform this date field such that we only fetch the month and the year. Okay, so let's try to do that first from our input data. So I'm just going to say customer. Okay, this is customer ID, and I'm going to call it like, let's say customer. Okay, and my second column would be sales date, and here I need to do a transformation. So I'm just going to use a function called as format, and I'm going to give the format like -y. Okay, yy. This should basically give me the month and year. Okay, and I'm just going to name this column as like, let's say sales date. And then finally I need to replace the dollar in my amount field. So I'm just going to say replace this dollar with a null symbol, and this will be, let's say, my amount field. Okay, so I think this is my input data or my base query. If I run this, you can see that I'm still getting the same number of 19 records, just that the date has been transformed to only fetch month and year, and the amount field now only displays the amount. It has removed the dollar. Okay, so first of all I'm just going to cut this and I'll just paste it inside my base query here. Okay, so that's my first part. Okay, so now my base query is ready. There is one thing that you need to remember. The thing is, you cannot just put any kind of query here. There are certain rules that you will need to follow when you are coming up with a base query. Okay, the first thing is this base query should have 3 columns at least. It can have more than 3 columns, but it should definitely have at least 3 columns. The first column in this case should basically be kind of your unique identifier for each row. It's kind of like a row ID. Okay, so for each row that you will be deriving from your pivot, this column here should basically kind of be like a unique ID for each row. Okay, that is what your first column should have, and I can do that just by using the customer ID column. And the second column here should basically provide the list of categories. That is, this column should provide all the different values with which you will basically be creating all the columns. Okay, so this column here, that is sales date, when I do this format right, it should basically return me all the values which I want to get transformed into a separate column. Okay, so I know with this kind of format, it's going to already returning me Jan 21, Feb 21, June 21, etc. right? And that is exactly what I want my different columns to be, right? That's the second column here. And then finally, the third column in my base query should basically be the value that will get loaded into each of this category that is returned from the second column here. Okay, so these are the things that you need to remember when you're coming with a base query. Of course, I can add some additional columns here as well, but those columns basically needs to be kind of like a hard-coded values. It has to be same for every single record. Okay, so I can do that, but in this case, I think for my particular query, I think this should be pretty good enough. It has all the data and everything that I need to do my pivot transformation. Okay, so once we are ready with the base query, the next thing is to do the aggregation. You can see here in my base query, I have not done any sum, I have not done any group by, because in Microsoft SQL Server pivot, we don't need to do it here. We just need to provide the raw data. Then inside the pivot function, this is where you will need to provide your aggregation. Okay, now I know that the aggregation that I will need to do here is the sum of amount. Okay, because you can see here when, so let's say I have this first three records here for the customer 1 for the month of Jan, and he has 50 orders. What I need to display is for customer 1 for the month of Jan, I just need to display 150. That is a sum of these three records, right? Sum of these three amount values. That is why I'm using the aggregate function as amount. And the next thing is, I told you whatever values will be returned from this column, that is basically going to be created as a new column in my final output, right? So that is why here after my for keyword, I just need to say that column name, whatever that column name might be here. Okay, for that column name, that is sales date, you need to basically provide all the different values that will be returned from this particular column. Okay, so in Microsoft SQL Server, instead of using single quotes, I can provide these values within a square bracket. So I'm just going to do that. So I'm just going to create a value for each month. So Jan 21, and then it is Feb 21, and I'm going to quickly create for all the other months. Okay, so I have created, basically I have provided these values for each month. So that is fine. Now I think we are pretty good. Now this should be pretty good enough, but I think we will get some error. We will try to run and check that. So first of all, when we are writing this kind of a syntax using pivot, we need to provide basically an alias for each of our subquery here. So this is kind of like a subquery, or I called it like a base query. We need to give an alias here. So I'm just going to call it like, let's say, sales data. Okay, and then here also I need to give an alias, and this one I'm just going to call it like, let's say, pivot table. Okay, now I think we are pretty good. Now if I run, okay, so there's one more thing that I'm getting error. Operand data type varchar is invalid. So basically this amount field here is a varchar. Okay, we have just replaced the dollar with a null value, but we still need to convert this amount into an integer so that this sum of this amount will work. So that is why I'm going to use the cast function. Here I'm just going to say as int, and I think now it should be pretty good. Okay, so you can see that now I executed and I'm already getting the data. So this is basically how pivot works in Microsoft SQL Server. Now if you look at this output carefully, you can see for cust1 for the month of Jan, it's displaying 150, and for every other month it's basically displaying null. If you go back here for customer 1, you can see that there are only these three records, and that is 150 for the month of Jan. When it comes to customer 2, I think you have how many, 6 records here, and it's for the month of Jan and Feb. You can see for Jan it should be 300, and for Feb it's minus 300, right? And the same thing is displayed here for customer 2, for Jan 300, for February minus 300, and for every other month it is null. And the same thing is happening for customer 3 as well. Okay, so now this is fine. We have basically come up with the first part of our solution. That is, I think from our solution we have kind of done this much, that is the aggregation of the sales amount for each customer for each month. The next thing that we will try to do is this last record here, that is the aggregation of sales amount for each month irrespective of the customer. How can we do that? Now what we can do is, if you see this data here, right, if I try to explain this once again, this base query will just provide you the raw data. Based on this data, SQL will try to do the sum of amount, okay, and it will try to create multiple columns based on the values that are returned from this sales date and what you have mentioned here, okay, and then each of these values will correspond to the values that is returned in the sales date column. Okay, and that is how the display is happening here. Okay, now the thing is, this aggregation of the amount is happening based on each customer, because this customer ID here from my sales data table is basically returning me 3 different customers. Okay, and hence when it's doing a sum of this amount, it's doing the sum of this amount for each customer. Now what I need in my next step is I need to do the sum of this amount irrespective of the customers. For that, what I can just do is I'll just copy that entire query. Okay, and I'm just going to use an union operator here, and I will just paste the second part of this query, basically the same query, and I'll just do one change. That is, now I want to do the aggregation irrespective of the customer. So instead of giving this customer ID here, I'll hard code a value called as total. Why? Because you can see here, this last record here has customer as total. So I'm just going to give this hard coded value. With this, what SQL will do is, when it's trying to do this sum of amount, this customer will always be total. So irrespective of what customer is, it's just going to do a sum of amount for each of this month, and then it's going to provide that output. So if I run this now you can see that this is just returning me one record. Why? Because there was just one customer that is by the name total, right? So the aggregation happened for this one customer only. So that is why you get the complete aggregated amount, but each of this amount is still getting spread across these 12 different columns that I have basically getting from this sales date column, and that is what I have defined here. Okay, I hope this is clear. This is basically how pivot works. Now I'm using a union because I want to basically merge this last record here and the first 3 records that we got from our initial query together into our final output. So now if I run this, now you can see I'm getting the 4 records. This is exactly what I wanted. Okay, so now we are pretty close. There's one last thing that we need to do here is to find this, that is the aggregation of sales amount for each customer irrespective of month. But before I do this, or in fact, if I have to do this, how can I do this? Just if you think carefully, right? I just need to sum up all of these 12 columns. The sum of these 12 columns will basically be the output here, right? So you can see 150 plus all of these zeros will return me 150. And here, if I do sum of all this, because it's 300 and minus 300, it's going to return me 0. And then again, the same thing here, right? So I need to do a sum up all of these 12 columns or 12 amounts in each of these months, and then that will be my total, right? But before I do that, here you can see I have this 0 and 0, right? But in my output that I have got from this query, it's returning me as null. Now I cannot sum null plus 150 will return me null. Okay, that is not what I want. So what I need to do is I need to transform this null into a 0. So whenever you need to convert a null into some other value, we can use a callis function in Microsoft SQL Server. Depending on other RDBMS, you may need to use other function, but callis is a function where you need, if you have to replace a null value with some other value, then we can use callis. Now, in order to transform this null into callis, what I can do is I can put this entire query into a subquery, or I can just use a with clause so that I can make this query a little neat, because already this query is pretty big. So I'm just going to say with sales data, okay, as, and then I'm just going to move this entire query to the right, and what I'll do is I'll create another with clause. Okay, so inside this with clause, I've already created this one temp table, and I'm going to give it a name like sales data. Now I'm going to create another temp table. This will be something like, let's say, or instead of sales data, I'm just going to call it like, let's say, pivot data. Okay, and what I'll do next is I'll create another temp table inside my with clause, and this one I'm just going to call it like, let's say, final data. And here I'll just say select star from that is my pivot data. Okay, and what I'm going to do is, when I'm doing this one, right, when I'm selecting the data from my pivot table, I'm going to do this transformation such that I can transform null into 0. So first of all, I'm going to fetch my customer ID column. That is, I hope it's not too confusing, because if I run this internal query here, or if I just select this entire query here, and if I run this, you can see that I'm getting this entire data. Now what I need to do is, this column stays as it is, but then for every of these other columns, I need to put a callis. So what I'm going to do is select customer ID, okay, and then I'll use a callis function. Okay, and here I will tell this one, that is Jan-21, okay, and I'll tell if it is null, then return me 0, and this column I'm just going to name it like Jan_21. Okay, so this is for my first column, Jan21, and I'll do the same for all the other 11 columns. Okay, so I have already done that, and now I think we are pretty good. So what I have done is, from my pivot data temp table that I have created in the above step, from that data, whatever I'm getting, this Jan, Feb and March values, I'm just using a callis function to replace null with 0. And then this everything I'm putting it inside another temp table and I'm naming it like final data. And finally in my main query, I'm just going to query from that final data table. So I'm just going to say select star from final data. And now if I run this, okay, I'm getting customer ID. Okay, it's not customer ID, it is customer. So now if I run this, now you can see that everything is still the same. The only thing is all the null values are now replaced with 0. Okay, so I hope it is clear. The query is a little big, so I cannot maybe show it in a single window. If I try to show it, it kind of becomes too small, but I hope everything is clear. So from my pivot data that I generated here, I got all the values, but wherever there was no value, it was returning null, and I wanted it to be transformed into 0 because in my next step I want to sum up all of these column values so I can get the last column, that is a total column. Okay, and that is why I have used this callis function, and I'm using this pivot data table. This pivot data is basically the query that I wrote in the previous step, that is inside my first with clause temp table. Okay, now I'm calling it like a temp table. It's not actually a temp table, but with clause kind of creates something similar to a temp table. But yeah, I just refer to it like a temp table, but don't treat it like a actual temp table. It's a temp table that with clause creates, and it will last only until the execution of this query. Okay, now this is fine. The next thing that we will need to do is we will need to come up with that last column. You can see here in the output, the last column here is basically the total column. Now we need to come up with this. How we can do this is we just need to sum up the values of these 12 columns or 12 months, right? So what I'm just going to do here is I'm just going to say select customer. Okay, and here, okay, now when I'm doing this, I will do that summing of all these column values, but I'll also do some additional transformation. That is, in my final output, you can see here I have all of these values, but the dollar symbol is missing, right? So I will try to do that transformation such that I will add a dollar to the end of these amount values. Secondly, wherever there are negative values, I'll replace the negative with a parenthesis, right? And you can see I have a negative value here, 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 and a few other places, right? So how I can do this is just by using a case statement. I can just tell case when Jan underscore 21, okay, is let's say less than 0. If it is less than 0, then I want to concat, that is, okay, so if it's less than 0, I want to concat it with open parenthesis first, and then I want to basically use that same Jan 21 value, okay, and then I want to multiply it with a -1 because this negative symbol here should get replaced with this parenthesis, right? So the negative, if you want to basically remove a negative value, you can just multiply the value with -1, and that's what I'm doing here. And after that, I just need to close the parenthesis and then add the dollar symbol. So I'm just going to say close the parenthesis and the dollar symbol, and I think that's it. This should be my concat. And let's say if the value is not less than 0. If the value is not less than 0, then I don't need to add this parenthesis, right? But I still need to concat the dollar symbol. So that's why I'm just going to say Jan underscore 21, and then I'm just going to add a dollar symbol at the end. And this is basically the end of my case statement. And this whole thing, I'm just going to name it like, let's say Jan dash 21. Okay, so I think that's all. Now if I just execute this, you can see that since I only defined this one column here in my outer query, just that one column is getting returned, and I think the value is as per how I want. So there is a dollar symbol added and everything else looks fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do the same copy paste of this and create it for all the other 11 months. Okay, so I have done that. Now I have basically added the same case statement for each month, and now if I run this, you can see that I'm getting the data for every month, and all of these negative values are now replaced with this parenthesis. So everything looks fine. The last thing that I will need to do here is basically add the last column, that is the total column. Now my total column is kind of like I need to do a sum up of all of these month values, right? So what I just can do is I'll just tell case when. So you can see here, if the customer name is total, if I go back to the output here, if it is total, then I want to display null, right? And only when it is other than total, I want to basically do the sum aggregation here. So what I'll just do is case when customer is equal to total, okay, then I will just display as null. Okay, so that's it. Else what I can do is I can just sum all of these month values together. So I'm just going to do this. So you can see here I'm just adding all the month values, Jan, Feb, March until December. Now this should be fine. So what I'm just going to do is I'll just close my case and I'm going to give a name for this, like let's say total. And now if I run this, you can see that I'm still getting the 4 records, and here I have got the last column, that is total. But the only problem here is this total value does not have a dollar symbol, and this negative symbol is still shown. So what I'll need to do is this case statement I used to do the transformation for each of these month values, I'll need to do the similar transformation for this total column as well. So what I can just do is here in my else part, when I'm displaying these values, I can put another case statement here telling that case when, and I'll tell something like if this whole value is less than 0. Okay, if this whole value is less than 0, then I want to do a concat. So I'm just going to say concat, and here I'll just open the parentheses, and the next value will be this whole value. So I'm just going to copy this whole value, and then the last is I need to close the parentheses and add a dollar symbol. Okay, so this is if the value is less than 0, but if it is greater than 0, then what I need to do is I need to put it in the else part. I'll do a concat, and here I will again display the entire value and concat with just the dollar symbol, right? I think that's all, and I'll end this inner case here. So you can see that inside the case statement I have used another case statement. Why? Because I wanted to add a dollar and transform this negative into a parenthesis. Okay, so now if I run this entire query, now you can see that I'm getting my final output. I think, okay, there's one problem here. I'm still getting -2 inside the parenthesis. So I will need to multiply this value here with a -1 in order to, when I'm concatenating the parenthesis, so that I can remove the negative value. And now if I run this, and you can see here the negative value is gone. Now I think this is exactly the output that I wanted basically in my problem statement. Okay, so this is basically how we have solved this problem. Now if I just try to shrink this window a little small so that you can see the entire query, you can see that the query is a little long, but I hope you understood this query, and this is basically how we can use pivot to solve this kind of problem. Now all of these scripts and SQL queries will be available in my blog as well as in my Discord channel, so you can download it from there. Now let's move ahead and try to solve the same problem using Oracle. The syntax is almost the same. There is very few changes between pivot in Microsoft SQL Server and pivot in Oracle. So we'll see how this query would look like in Oracle. Okay, so now let's try to solve the same problem in Oracle. Now I'm connected to the Oracle database and I'm using the SQL developer tool. So what I'm going to do is the same query that I have written in Microsoft SQL Server to solve this problem, I'm going to paste the same query in this SQL developer tool. Now I'm not going to write this query from scratch, simply because the query is 90% same in Oracle. There are just few syntactical differences that I'm going to explain now. Okay, but other than that, the logic, the flow, the use of pivot, everything is the same. Okay, so we'll just see what is the difference here. Okay, so first of all, the first difference is that in Oracle we do not have this function called as format. When we want to fetch only month and year from date, instead of format we can use something called as toChar, and here I can just give the format like MON, and I can just give YY. Okay, and then I will do the same thing in the below query here as well. Instead of format I'll give toChar, I'll replace the format MMM with MON. Okay, so this is the first thing that you will need to do. Now the second thing is that inside this base query we gave an alias here, and we gave an alias for our pivot part as well. But when it comes to Oracle does not require this alias. If you give an alias, it's going to throw an error. So second thing is we will remove this alias, and we'll do this for both our union queries. Okay, so that's the second thing. Now the third thing is in Microsoft SQL Server, whenever you want to basically provide a value, you can provide a value within the square bracket, but in Oracle you cannot use square bracket, but rather we can use single quotes. So I'm just going to use single quotes, and I can give the value like this, but what will happen is the final output, our column names, will basically display as it is with the single quotes, and I would not want that to happen. So I'm just going to give an alias here like Jan_21, so that we can use this name wherever we have to refer to that column going ahead in our query. Okay, so that's one thing, and I'm going to do this for every single column here. So I already have it with me, so I'm just going to paste that value. So I just replaced the square brackets with the single quotes, and I gave an alias here. Okay, so that I think is the third thing. And the fourth thing that we will need to do is, okay, so I'm just going to do the same in my below query here as well. I'll replace all of these values like this. And the fourth thing that we'll need to do is, in Oracle, callis function is not supported. Instead of callis, we can use a function called as nvl. So we'll need to do that. And secondly, again here we are using this square bracket and the column name. Instead of this, we can just use the column name that we basically gave above. Okay, and I'm going to do this for every single month. Okay, so I already have this code with me, so I'm just going to paste it, and that's, I think, is the fourth thing. And then, okay, so let me try to run it. Let's see if it works. And if I run it again, I'm getting an error like invalid number of arguments. So I think there is something else that I need to change. Okay, the next thing that I will need to change, or I think it's the fifth change, is this concat function, right? In Microsoft SQL Server will accept, I think, any number of arguments, but in Oracle it only accepts 2 arguments. So if you want to concat 2 values, then you can use the concat function. But if you want to basically concatenate more than 2 values, then instead of concat, we can use the pipe operator. So I can just remove this comma, I can use this double pipe operator. And so basically instead of concat, I'm using this double pipe operator. Okay, that's all. And if you have to concatenate 2 values, then you can still use the concat function. But when you want to merge more than 2 values, then you will need to use the concat or basically the double pipe operator. Okay, so I'm just going to follow that here as well. Okay, so I think that's all, and I will need to do the same for every single column here. So I'm just going to do that. Again, I already have this piece of code, so I'm just going to paste it here. Okay, and okay, so let me just move this a little down. Okay, so I think that's all now. Okay, here also I will need to replace the concat with the pipe operator. So double pipe here and here as well. Okay, and I'll remove the parentheses from the end, and again in the else part as well, I'll remove the concat, and I'll replace the comma with the double pipe operator, and I will remove the last parenthesis of concat. Okay, so I think that's all. Then everything else should be the same. Let me run it now, and now you can see that I'm already getting the output. I think did 5 different changes, and you can see that I am getting the output exactly how I wanted. So if you see carefully, the data is exactly how it is mentioned in my output here. Okay, so that's all. This is basically how we kind of use the same query that we written in Microsoft SQL Server and basically used it in Oracle. Only few changes. Just to quickly explain, the changes that I did was replaced format function with toChar function and used the proper date formatting in Oracle. Then I removed the alias that I had given for my pivot as well as for my base query. Okay, and then I replaced the square bracket with the single quotes, and then I gave an alias for each of these columns, and then I used that column name in my main query here, or basically my second with clause query here, and I replaced the callis function with nvl, and then finally I replaced the concat function with this double pipe operator to merge multiple values. Okay, so that's all. Just by doing these changes, the same query was able to get transformed into Oracle. Okay, I hope this is clear. Now let's try to solve this same problem in PostgreSQL using the CROSSTAB function. Now, in order to solve the same problem in PostgreSQL database, I'm using the pgadmin tool, and as you can see, I have created the same table sales data with the same data here. Okay, now in PostgreSQL, we do not have something called as a pivot, but we have something called as a CROSSTAB function. But in order to use this CROSSTAB function, we will first need to create an extension called tablefunc. Okay, so in order to create the extension, I can just tell create extension tablefunc. Okay, and this will basically create an extension, and as part of this extension we can basically use the CROSSTAB function. Okay, now in order to use the CROSSTAB function, we basically provide the CROSSTAB function in our from clause. Okay, so we can just say select star from CROSSTAB. Okay, and then CROSSTAB function will accept 2 arguments. Now the second argument is optional, but we will see why it is important a little later. First, we'll just try to create with the first argument. Okay, so the first argument the CROSSTAB function will accept is basically your base query. Okay, the kind of like the similar query that we created in Microsoft SQL Server and in Oracle. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going back to my Oracle, and I will copy the base query here, okay, that we created. So I'm just going to paste it in my PostgreSQL. So I'll just paste it here because I need to explain a little about this. Okay, so let me minimize this. Okay, so now this is my base query. If I run this, you can see that I'm getting the data like how I got it in Oracle and in Microsoft SQL Server. We just transformed the date to only fetch the month and the year, and we transformed the amount such that we removed the dollar symbol from there. Okay, now I can use this base query as it is inside my CROSSTAB function, but there will be some problem. We will see that later. For now, we'll just use the same base query that we used for in other RDBMS as well. Okay, so we need to pass this SQL query, or kind of like our base query, as a text for this CROSSTAB function. So since we are going to be passing it like a text, we'll need to put it inside a single quote. Okay, so when we are enclosing basically any text inside a single quote, if that text is having any other single quotes, then we will need to escape it. We can do that by just by putting another single quote here. Okay, so that's what I'm just doing it here, and I'll do it for everywhere where we are using this single quotes. Okay, so that's all. Now I think this base query will be accepted as an argument, as a text argument inside our CROSSTAB function. That's the first thing. Now I can also pass a second argument, which basically is the list of values, or kind of like the list of columns that will need to be created. Okay, now we will use that a little later, but I'll just explain you here. Now this base query that we are using inside our CROSSTAB, right, this also has a few rules that you need to follow. Again, like Oracle and in Microsoft SQL Server, this query minimum has to return 3 columns. Now the first column has to basically be kind of like your unique row ID. It has to kind of represent each unique row that will be returned. Okay, and then the second column is basically the list of categories, that is how all the different columns that we will need to create, right, as part of our pivot or as part of our CROSSTAB. Those list of columns needs to be returned from this particular column here, sales date. Okay, and then finally the last column is basically the value that will get returned into each of the columns that was created from basically here, that is from our second step here. Okay, so that's all. That is kind of the rules that you need to follow when you are giving an SQL query here. Okay, now once you have done this, there is one additional thing that you will need to do in CROSSTAB, and that is you will basically need to provide the list of all your final columns. Okay, once you execute this query, what is the final list of columns that will be returned? So of course you will need to have a customer ID. You will need to provide that. Along with that, all the other columns that you would want to get displayed from your final output, right? So you will not just need to provide the column name, but also you will need to provide the data type. Okay, so first column that I need to have in my output, I know, is basically my customer column, and it's basically a varchar, so I'll need to provide the data type as it is. It's very important that the column values that are returned here with a particular data type, that same data type you will need to provide it here along with that same column name. Okay, so this is my first column, customer ID. The second column would be something like, let's say, Jan_21, and this would be, I think, int. Okay, and the same thing for every month, Feb_21, and this would be int as well, and so on and so forth for every other month. So I'm just going to quickly paste it. So I already have that. I pasted these values, and basically that's all. I think this one should basically work. Let me run this now. And you can see that now my row level data, previously this base query was having data something like this, right? Row level data, 19 records. And now just by putting it inside a CROSSTAB function as an argument here, okay, and then passing the final list of columns, you can see here whatever values that I give, that will kind of be the output returned from this entire query. So if I run this, you can see that I am getting Jan 21. Okay, first column is customer, that is this column, then Jan 21, Feb 21, March, etc. Okay, if I did not provide all of these columns, so let's say if I remove all of these columns and if I ran this, now you see that it's only going to return the columns that you have mentioned here. So this part here is very important because this is basically what your final output would look like, okay, based on what you have mentioned here. Okay, now this is fine, and if you look at the data carefully, you are already doing this transformation from row to column. But if you look carefully, the data is actually not correct. For example, you see the very first record, customer 1 here. So if I just zoom in a little, you can see that the customer 1 is saying Jan 50, Feb 50 and March 50. Now if I go back to my Excel and look at the input data here, you can see here for the month of Jan, or basically for the customer 1, he has 3 amounts, so basically 3 orders. All the orders are of amount 50, but all these 3 are for the same month Jan. But in my final output here, it displayed under Jan, Feb and March. Now why this is happening is because in our input data for the customer 1 we have 3 records. So what PostgreSQL will do is it's just going to take one record at a time. So it's going to take the first record. It belongs to customer 1, right? And it has a value of 50. So it's just going to post this, or basically print this 50 value into the very first column it finds. Then it goes to the second record. It finds another record for customer 1, and again with the value 50. So it's again for the same customer, but it's a next record. So that next record will just get transformed into the second column here. And similarly, the third record will get transformed into the third column here, that is into the March. Okay, it's basically not validating if this value needs to go into Jan or which particular month. Okay, the reason why this is happening is this transformation here depends on the number of records that are returned from your base query. Okay, so in this particular case, when we are using CROSSTAB in PostgreSQL, it's important that we will do the aggregation manually here. Okay, when in Microsoft SQL Server and in Oracle, we didn't have to do the aggregation, that is, we didn't have to do the group by, we didn't have to do the sum, but in CROSSTAB we will need to do it, because we will need to provide the data to PostgreSQL in a particular way, such that for every customer for a particular month there is just one record in the base query, so that all the transformation can happen accordingly. Okay, so how we can do that is, what I'm just going to do is the same base query, I'll just modify it using a group by. So I'm just going to add a group by here. Okay, and I'm going to group by, let's say, customer ID, and also I'm going to group by based on each month. Okay, so that's there, and I will also do an order by here. So I'll say order by 1. Okay, and everything else same here. I'll just do a sum of this amount. Okay, now this order by that I'm using here is actually very important in CROSSTAB. If I did not use order by, the output will be completely different, and we will see that in a short while. Okay, now what I'll do is if I run this query here, now you can see for each customer for a particular month there will be just one record. So for customer 2, for Jan there is one record, for Feb there is another record, and same way for customer 3. Okay, now we'll just try to use the same base query inside our CROSSTAB function. So what I'm just going to do is I'll just add the group by here. So I'm just going to copy this entire group by and order by. Okay, so I'll just paste it here. Okay, and then here I will need to use the sum aggregate function, and I think that's all. Now if I just run this, okay, I'm getting an error. Okay, because I have a single quote here, I'll need to transform them into two single quotes, so it kind of becomes a proper text. And now if I run, I'm getting another error. Okay, now this another error here, it's telling return and SQL tuple descriptions are incompatible. The reason for that is, I told you, whatever data type is returned from this query, so all the column values that are returned and its data type needs to be exactly matching with the data type that you have mentioned here for each of those columns. Okay, now if I run this query as a whole here, you can see that this amount field now is returning big int. Previously when I did not use sum, it was returning me an integer, but since I'm using a sum, it's an aggregate function. This sum aggregate function will return the value which will be of data type big int. Okay, that means all of this Jan, Feb, March, all of these column values here will be in big int data type, and that is why I'll need to convert this big int, basically this int, into big int. Okay, so if I just convert all of this into big int, let me do that. Okay, and let me just zoom in, and okay, so I just transformed all the int into big int, and now if I run this, hopefully it should work. And now you can see that the transformation is working absolutely fine. I'm getting the data. Okay, now you can see for customer 1, for Jan it's telling 150, whereas for every other month it is telling as null. Okay, same way for customer 2, if I go back to my Excel here, you can see for customer 2, I think there are this many 6 records. So for Jan he has 3 records, and for Feb I think he has 3 records. So aggregation for Jan would be 100 plus 100 plus 100, that is 300, and for Feb, for customer 2, there is minus 100 plus minus 100 plus minus 100, which will be minus 300. And if I look at the data here, for customer 2, for Jan it is plus 300, for Feb it is minus 300, and then for everything else it is null. Okay, because there is no entry, basically there is no sales order for customer 2 for any other month. Right, so that is fine. Okay, so now we are getting the aggregation, but if you look carefully, the output that we're getting is actually not correct, because for example, let's look at this customer 3. So if I just zoom in, you can see that for customer 3, it's saying for Jan he has -1, for Feb -1, and then for November and December it is null. Okay, but if I look at my input data, or kind of like my output data, for Jan and Feb actually there is no value, but for December and for November there is value under customer 3. Okay, because depending on what was provided. So for customer 3, he had some orders in November and December, but he did not have any order in Jan and Feb. but the output that we have got from CROSSTAB function in PostgreSQL, it kind of has done it reversely. That is, for Jan and Feb it has some value, but for November and December it does not. The reason why this is happening is because as soon as CROSSTAB will find a value, it will just load that value into the very first column it finds. It's not going to compare if that value should correspond to Jan month, Feb month, November month, December month, or etc. Okay, whatever value it is finding, so from this base query here, whatever value it find, it will just load that value into each of the columns that you have defined here. Okay, now if you want to make sure that the values are loaded into the proper columns, this is where you will need to provide a second argument. Okay, and that second argument you can basically provide it here for your CROSSTAB function. So you can just put a comma here and then provide a second argument. Okay, now the second argument is also actually a string, and it kind of will accept a value. So either you can pass an actually SQL query which returns kind of like one column with all the 12-month values, or you can basically manually specify each of the month values here. Okay, so this is kind of like the values that you need to pass that will be returned from your sales date column. Okay, so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to pass it here. So you just need to pass it within the parentheses, first value, second values, etc. So here I'm just going to say it is going to return Jan 21, and this value should be exactly same that will be returned from your sales date column. Okay, that is your second column in your base query. Okay, so again, since it's a text, I will need to escape the single character using another single character, and the same thing I will need to do for every month. Okay, so I'll just say Feb 21, and I will try to do the same for every other month. Okay, so I'll just paste the values that I already have. Let me just zoom out a little so it becomes more clear. Okay, so I think that's all we have, and I think I'll need to remove this additional comma that I had here, and I think everything else is fine. So I just passed in the second argument here. This argument is basically all the different values that will be written from this column. The value has to be exactly a match. Okay, so by adding this second argument, we will then make sure that when PostgreSQL is loading value into each of these newly created columns, it's going to compare those values returned from here with the values that you have mentioned here, and it's basically going to do the match and then add the values. Okay, so I'll just run this query. Now before I run, just check here for customer 3. You can see for Jan Feb he has value, but for the last two column he doesn't. Now after I added the second argument, if I run this, okay, so I'm getting some error. Let me try to fix that error first. Okay, actually it's not value, it should be values. So now let me run this, and now you can see it's working fine. And you can see here for Jan and Feb, now it's returning null, but for December and November, it's having the correct value. Okay, so this is basically the reason why you will need to use your second argument in CROSSTAB to make sure that the values are loaded into the correct columns. Okay, now this is fine. There is one more thing that I want to explain here is the importance of using an order by. So let's say if I did not use an order by here, and if I run the same query, now you can see that instead of returning just 3 records, it's returning multiple records. So there are multiple records for each customer. This is a weird thing that happens in CROSSTAB in PostgreSQL. I'm going to explain you why this happens. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take screenshots. I already have taken a screenshot of this entire result set here. Okay, and I'm going to run this base query. So this base query that is mentioned here, right, depending on what is written from this base query, your CROSSTAB is going to work. Okay, so let's try to compare the result of this base query with the result of our CROSSTAB, so we kind of understand why order by is so important in CROSSTAB. Okay, so I'm just going to run this group by clause here. Okay, and let me just zoom in a little, and I'll just expand this. Okay, and then let me just bring both the result from our CROSSTAB as well as from our base query into a single screen. Okay, so it becomes more easier for you to see. Okay, so I have it here. Now I hope it's not too confusing. The above result set that you see here, basically it's a screenshot, is the screenshot of my CROSSTAB function, and the below data that you see is the data from my base query. Now what exactly happened without order by was, when I did not use order by, my base query here returned the data in any order. In basically it did not follow any order. So you can see that I have first 2 records for customer 3, Then I have one record for customer 2. Then again I have customer 3 records. I think 5 records for customer 3. Then I have a record for customer 2. Then again one record for customer 3. Then again a record for customer 1, and so on and so forth. Okay. So this customer ID is not in proper order. Due to this, what happens is when PostgreSQL is processing these records inside the CROSSTAB, as soon as it finds records which belong to the same customer ID, that is the unique identifier for this particular CROSSTAB, it's going to create one record from those combination of records. So for this first 2 records belongs to customer 3. So when it provides the, it kind of does the transformation in CROSSTAB, from these 2 records, it's going to return one record. Okay. So you can see here for customer 3, it's just returning one record where you have value for August and September, as you can see in the first 2 record. Okay. When it comes to the third record here, this belongs to customer 2. So for customer 2 is different from the customer 3 from the first 2 records. So for this customer 2, and the very next record is again not customer 2. So for this sole record, that is for this customer 2 record, it's going to transform it into just one record where it's going to populate the data for February. Okay, and that is exactly what is happening here. When it comes to the next record, it sees that for customer 3 there is one record, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so there are 5 records which belongs to customer 3. So these 5 records will get basically merged together or aggregated together into a single record in the CROSSTAB. So this record number 3, customer 3, you can see here there is data populated for April, May, June, July, and then finally for November, and that is exactly what you see: April, November, July, June and May. Okay, and then finally when it comes to customer 2 record here, it's going to create another record for customer 2 and it's going to populate the value for Jan, because here it is for Jan, right? And the same thing happens for every other record. Okay, I'm not sure how much you understood this. If this is not clear, just go back in my video and try to watch it again, because it's kind of confusing. It's a weird feature that CROSSTAB has, but it's a very important feature that you need to understand. Just by not using an order by or not using the proper order by, your entire CROSSTAB result might differ. Okay, so that's the importance of using CROSSTAB, because you need to basically, your base query should provide all the data such that for the same customers all the data is in the same order. Okay, so if it is in bundled up in different orders, then it's going to create one record for each unique customer. Okay, so that's one thing that you need to remember. I think that's the major difference in CROSSTAB. I think now, okay, I'm going to use the order by again here to make the data proper, order by 1. Okay, and now if I run this, I'm getting the data. So this basically is the first part of my output, where I have got this result, that is aggregation of a sales order data for each customer and for each month. The next thing is I need to basically, I'll do one thing. I will, okay, first of all, I'm just going to remove all of this. I'll copy the entire query and I will add in a union clause here to add the query again. Okay, and let me just zoom out a little so I can, because these queries are pretty big, so I just want to show it as a whole. So what I need to do next is, I have got these 3 records. The next thing is, again similar to what we did in Oracle and in Microsoft SQL Server, we need to find the aggregation of sales order for each month irrespective of the customer. So for that, what I'll do is, instead of providing a customer ID here, I'll just hard code a value like total. Okay, and then I will remove that customer ID from my group by clause here, and I think that's all. Now if I run this query, it should basically return me just one record where it's basically aggregating the entire sales data irrespective of the customer, but for each month, as you can see here. Okay, now since I'm using a union, and if I run that entire query, you can see that I'm getting the 4 records that I want, but the order of this data is not in proper order. So what I'll do is, at the end, I'll just say order by 1. Okay, this order by is for the entire result set. Okay, now you can see I'm having customer 1, 2 and 3 in sequence, and then I have the total. Okay, so this is fine. We have got basically this data here. Now the last 2 things that we will need to do is, one, we'll need to add this column, that is a total column at the end, and then we will need to basically add the dollar symbol, basically suffix the dollar symbol and then replace the negative values with the parentheses, right? In order to do that, I will basically follow the same thing that I did in Oracle and in Microsoft SQL Server. I will just move this entire query into a with clause. I'm going to call it like, let's say, pivot data. Okay, and I will just move this to the right. Okay, and I will add a parenthesis here, and this is basically the first temp table inside my with clause. I'll create another one which I'll call it like final data, and this will kind of be a data where I want to transform these null values into 0, right? So that then later on I can do the aggregation, which I already explained when I was explaining Microsoft SQL Server query, right? So in order to do that, what I'm just going to do is I'll basically go back to Oracle. So I'll just go back to Oracle. I'll just copy this entire thing from this final data till the very end. Okay, so I think till here, and I'll go back to PostgreSQL and I'll just paste that entire thing here. The same thing that we did in Oracle and in Microsoft SQL Server. So that's why I'm not rewriting this query. There are of course few changes that we will need to do. The first thing is in PostgreSQL, NVL does not work, but coalesce will work. So I'll use coalesce function here instead of NVL, and I'll replace it everywhere here. Okay, and I think that's all. Probably everything else should work. So let me just run this, and you can see that everything worked absolutely fine. So I'm still getting the final data here exactly how I wanted it in my final output. Okay, so I have not explained the second part of this query because I already explained it in Microsoft SQL Server. The only thing that I explained here was CROSSTAB and what is the difference if you don't use an order by, and why you should be using the second argument, and so on and so forth. Other than this, the second part of the query where we needed to basically suffix each value with a dollar and then replace a negative value with parentheses, it's all same in all these three RDBMS, just you may need to use a different function for each RDBMS. Okay, I hope this is clear. Now let's go on to the last database, that is MySQL, and try to solve the same problem using case statement. Okay, so now finally let's move to the MySQL database. As you can see, I'm using the MySQL workbench tool, and we are going to solve this problem in MySQL using case statement, because in MySQL pivot is not supported nor CROSSTAB is supported. So whenever you have this kind of a requirement to transform row level to column level data, we can use case statement. So let's see how we can do that. Now, as you can see, I have already created the table and the data is already loaded. It's the same data and it's the same table that we have in our problem statement. Okay, now the very first thing that we will need to do is we'll try to transform this raw data into a format that we need. What are the different things that we will need to do is, first I will need to remove this dollar symbol, as I explained already in the previous solutions for other RDBMS, and then from this date field I am only interested in fetching the month and the year. So we'll try to do that transformation. Okay, so what I'm just going to do is I'm going to say customer ID as customer. Okay, and then I'm just going to say I'm going to use a function called as date format to fetch the month and the year. So I'm just going to say sales date, and here I'm going to give the format like, let's say %b dash, I think %y. Okay, and this one I'm just going to give an alias like, let's say sales date, and then finally the last column is amount. I'm going to replace the dollar symbol from the amount field, and I'm going to replace this dollar with, I think, a null value, and I'm going to name this column like, let's say amount. Okay, and I think that's all. Now if I run this, now you can see I'm still having the same number of records, but the data is transformed in a way that I want it for my processing, right? So this is the very first thing. We have built our base query. The next thing is, let's see what are the different things that we will need to do. First, we will need to basically aggregate the sales order data for each customer, and then aggregate that sales amount and display it under its corresponding month, right? So let's try to do this. So in order to do this, right, the concept that we can use is case statement. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this base query inside a with clause just so that it becomes more neater. I'm going to call it like, let's say base query. Okay, and I'm going to use the as clause, and here I'm just move it to the right, and I need to put this query inside a parenthesis, so I will do that. And then finally in my main query or my outer query, I'm just going to print this data just to show you that there is no difference as of now. Now if I just run this, you can see I'm still getting okay, so I'm getting an error. I think what might be the error here, so I am doing this, so let's run this. Okay, so I think the name is slightly different, so I'm just going to use this name, that is base query, and now let me run this. Okay, so I'm getting the data. So in MySQL, I told you that we have to use case statement. The reason why I need to use case statement is because the very first column that I will need in my output is this customer column. I know that, and I already have it here, so that is fine. But all the other columns that I will need is not present in my base query or is not present in my input table, right? So I will kind of like need to derive those columns. So whenever you need to derive those columns based on certain conditions, then we can use case statement. So if I have to explain you that, I'm just going to give you a sample here. So I'm just going to say select customer, and here I'm just going to say case when. Okay, so whenever my sales date field, let's say if it is Jan, okay, so I'm just going to copy that. If it is equal to Jan 21, okay, then let's say I want to print something. What do I need to print? So let's say I will just print the amount, okay, and if it is not Jan, I want to print it like, let's say else 0, okay, and I'll end my case statement, and I'm going to give an alias for this, like let's say Jan underscore 21, okay, and I will do the same. So for, let's say, for a few other months, so I'm just going to copy this, okay. In fact, I'll copy this for every other month, okay. So let's try to do this. I'll just quickly do this. Okay, so I have just done the same thing for each month. So what I have done is, this is my base query. As you can see the data here. From here, I'm just fetching the customer as it is from the base query, and then for each month, I am creating one case statement and I'm deriving a new column with the month name, right? So I'm then displaying the amount field. So what happens here is, SQL will process these records one by one, okay. So when it's going to process the first record, it's going to see that the sales date is Jan 21 and the amount is 50. So in this column, it's going to print 50, okay. When it's going to find this case, it's going to see if the first record is having Feb. It's not. So in this particular case, only this particular record will be successful. So only for Jan field, this 50 will get displayed. When it is going to process the second record, again it's going to see that this case statement will be successful. So it will going to print an amount for Jan, but for all the other months, it's not going to, it's basically going to display just 0, okay, because the sales date is not Feb. So whenever we process a customer or a record who is having, so let's say Feb, okay, in this particular case, cus2 is having Feb. In this case, this case statement will be successful here. This sales date will be equal to Feb 21, and it's going to print the amount that in this case is minus 100, okay. And then all the other case for that particular record will basically print 0, okay. So let's see how the result would look like. Now, if I run this, you can see that from row level, I have already transformed it into a column level. Only thing is, I'm getting multiple records for each customer because I have still not done the aggregation. But I hope you understand this first step, that is how do you create row to column. So just by using a case statement and just by giving a condition, in this case, because each column here needs to hold value based on each month, right? That is why I'm using this sales date equal, I'm matching it with a particular month and then displaying the amount if it's a match. If it's not a match, then I'm just displaying 0, okay. So this basically is kind of like the skeleton to our query, okay. Now this is fine, and you can see I'm getting like what? I'm getting one record for each data that was present in my base query. But this is not how I want my final output, right? My final output should be such that, and for now we are only implementing these 3 records. I just need one record for each customer. So this means I will need to group the data for each customer, and when doing so, I will need to do the sum of the amount. You can see here for customer 1, there are 3 records and all 3 belongs to Jan, and the amount is 50, 50, 50. So when I group by customer, and if I do a sum of amount, I will get 150. And since the month is Jan, it's going to print this 150 for Jan, and for every other month, it's going to print it like 0. Okay, so what I will basically need to do is from this query, if I just put a group by here, so if I just put group by, let's say customer, okay, and here if I just put a sum, okay. Now when putting a sum here, there is one thing that you need to remember. So of course I can put a sum of amount here, and this should still give me the data, but it's not going to give me the data how I want. Why? First of all, this is going to give me an error, because since if I use the sum here, and since this sales date column is not within an aggregate function and it is not part of my group by also, SQL is going to throw an error, because as per SQL, whenever you are using a group by, any column that you mention in the group by clause, only those columns can be present in your select clause without enclosed within the aggregate function. Meaning that if you want to use any column here, and if you don't want to put that column within the aggregate function, then those columns should be part of our group by. So if I put a sum of amount here for every column here, then this sales date will not be part of my aggregate function and it is not part of my group by, so it's going to throw an error. One way of fixing it is just by putting this sales date inside my group by here. Okay, but if I do that, then again I'm going to not get just one record for each customer, I will get multiple records, because for example, if you see here, this customer 2 here has an entry for Jan as well as for entry for Feb. So what will happen is when I do a group by the sales date and the customer ID, then it's going to create basically two groups, that is one group with customer 2 for Jan and the second group for customer 2 with Feb. Okay, and I do not want that to happen. I want one group to be created for each unique customer, right? So meaning that in my group by, I still only want to maintain the customer column. So the other way of doing this is, instead of putting this sum aggregate function for each amount here, I can do this aggregation for the entire case. Okay, so I can put the entire case within my sum aggregate function. In this case, it's still going to aggregate the amount for each customer, but when doing so, it's also going to check if that record value is matching with this particular condition. Only if that sales amount is Jan, then it's going to do the aggregation of amount, and for this Jan column, only that aggregation will get displayed. Okay, so this way we can kind of solve this problem. So I'm going to do this for every other column here. So I'm just going to print this. So I'll put some here and I'll need to close the parentheses here for every column. So I'll quickly do this. Okay, so I think that's all. Now if I just run this query, so let's say if I run this query, now you can see that from multiple records for each customer, now I'm only getting 3 records, 1 record for each customer. Okay, why? Because I grouped the data for each customer and then I did the aggregation for the entire case. Now you can see that for customer 1, for Jan it's displaying 150, whereas for all other months it's displaying 0. Why? You can see for customer 1, he only has the sales order in Jan. When it comes to customer 2, he has a sales order of, I think, plus 300 in Jan and minus 300 in Feb. So if I go back here, you can see for customer 2 plus 300 in Jan and minus 300 in Feb, and for every other month it is 0. And the same thing happens for customer 3 as well. Okay, so this way we have kind of solved the very first part of our query, that is aggregating the sales order data for each customer and displaying the amount corresponding to each month in its own column. Okay, so this is the very first thing. Now what I'm going to do is, I have done this in my main query, but I also need to do one additional thing, right? That is, I also need to do the aggregation of the sales order for each month irrespective of the customer, right? Again, in order to do this, I can just copy and paste this entire query and put it in with after my union clause. So I can just create a union here. I'll put the same query here, and in the second part of this query, what I'm going to do is, instead of aggregating the data based on customer, I will just do the sum of the whole amount, and then it will basically aggregate the amount based on the month. Okay, so I don't need to do the aggregation for each customer. So here, instead of mentioning the customer from the base query, I'm going to hard code it to total. Why? Because you can see here for this last record, the customer is mentioned as total. So I'm just going to put it like total, and I'll remove this group by because I don't need to do that. Okay, now if I just run this entire query, hopefully I should get my last record, and I have got it. So this is kind of like the aggregation of the sales order for each month irrespective of the customer. Why? The customer, I have already hard coded it to like some constant value, that is total. Okay, I hope this is clear. So we kind of finished the two parts of this query. The last part here we will need to do is find the last column. That is, if you see here, that is this particular column total. It's basically the aggregation of the sales order amount for each customer irrespective of the month. Okay, in order to do this, here you can see that I have done the aggregation for each customer, but I have done it with respect to specific month, right? Now if I do not want to consider any month, then what I can do is I can just say sum of amount, and this will be like my total. So here it's still grouping the data based on customer, but the sum of amount will happen for each customer irrespective of the month. Okay, now since I have added this column here in my union query as well, I also need to add that same column. But for my total, you can see here the last column, that is for my record with this total, the last column total here is displayed as null, right? So I'm just going to hard code it to null. I'm going to tell this column name to be like total. Okay, now if I just run this query, you can see that I'm almost got the data that I want. Okay, so the only thing that is now pending is basically to suffix a dollar symbol to each of these values, and then to replace this negative symbol with the parentheses. right? So let's try to do that now. Now in order to do that, I can put this entire query into a subquery, but in order to make it more neat, what I will do is I'll create another with clause, okay? And here I'm just going to call it like, let's say final data, okay? And I'll use the as clause and I'll then move this to the right, okay? And I will need to put this entire query inside the parentheses. So I will do that, and I will basically write a outer query here, or the main query here, where I'm just going to display the data from, let's say this is my final data, right? So final data, okay? Now if I run this, I'll still get the same output, because the only change I did was I moved this this union query that I have written inside my second with clause, or basically my same with clause but my second temp table inside the with clause, and I'm naming it like final data, okay? And here this is where I will do the final transformation. That is, I'm going to print the customer, and here I'm going to say basically the same thing that I did in my other RDBMS. So what I'll do is case when, okay, let's say Jan underscore 21 is less than 0, because if the value is negative, then I want to replace this negative value with a parenthesis, right? As you can see here, so negative values are displayed, removed, and they are basically replaced with the parenthesis, and there is a dollar at the end for every value. So we'll need to do these two things. So I'm going to say if Jan value is less than 0, then I will do a concat. I can use the concat function here. I'm going to say open parentheses, okay, and then I'm just going to, I'm just going to print this Jan 21 value here, and I'm going to multiply this with -1, because I know this condition is basically when the Jan underscore 21 value is less than 0. So if it is less than 0, if I multiply it with -1, then the negative symbol will kind of get replaced with a positive symbol, right? And then I want to again concatenate this with the close parenthesis and a dollar symbol, okay? And I think that's all. And this is my then part in my case statement, and the else part is, let's say if the value is not negative, then I don't need to basically put in the parenthesis, but I still need to concatenate the dollar symbol. So for that, I'm just going to say Jan underscore 21 and then concatenate it with the dollar symbol, okay? And this will be my end, and here I'm just going to name it like Jan underscore 21, okay? And I will need to do this same. Okay, so before I do it for the every month, let me just execute this. Let's see if I'm getting the output, and you can see I'm getting the output for 1 month Jan. Now I will do the same for every other month, okay? So I already have the snippet of this code, so I'm just going to paste it here. Okay, so now I have basically done the same thing for every other month, as you can see here. And here I was basically printing, I need to print the value, or basically my column name should be like Jan-21, as you can see here. That is the expected column name, right? And since it's a dash, I cannot basically, if I just give this without the double quotes, it's not going to accept, so I need to give it within the double quotes, okay? So if I run this, I think this should probably work, and you can see I'm getting all the data. The only thing missing here is the last column, that is total. So we'll try to add that last column as well. So I'm just going to copy this, yes, okay, and I will replace this December with total, okay? Now for this total, I need to do one small additional change, okay? And that is, so let's say if I run this, you can see that I'm getting the data as I want, but here the last column where it should have been null, it's displaying with a dollar symbol. So because I'm getting this null is from this second part of my union query here, where I was aggregating the data for each month irrespective of the customer, right? That is where we had hard-coded this to null. So I need to handle that null value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this entire case statement inside another case statement. I'm going to say case when total is equal to null, then I want to still display as null, okay? Only for other cases, that is in my else part, I will do this entire case statement, okay, where I am basically concatenating with the dollar symbol, or replacing the negative with a parenthesis, etc. Okay, and then once this case statement is done, I will again end my outer case statement as like this. Okay, so I think this should probably work. Now let me run this, and you can see that it has worked, and I'm getting the final output like how I wanted. Okay, so all of this code, the query, the dataset, everything is available in my in my blog and in my Discord channel. So if you want, you can download it and you can practice it on your own. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon in the next video. Bye.